It was one of those nights in New York that felt like it was straight out of a horror movie. The rain was pouring relentlessly, hammering against the windows of the apartment where we were gathered. There were 4 of us: my cousin Daniel, his girlfriend Clara, my best friend Javier, and me. We had decided to have a small get-together to celebrate Daniel's birthday, but the atmosphere was strange, as if the weather had brought something more than just rain and cold. Daniel, always the life of the party, had been telling scary stories all night. They weren't your typical urban legends. He claimed they were things he had actually experienced. We laughed, brushed them off, but something in his tone made me think that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely joking. Toward the end of the night, when the wine had kicked in and the rain seemed to intensify, Daniel dropped the bomb. "There's a cemetery a few blocks from here," he said, staring at us intently. "They say if you go there at midnight and light a candle, you can see things you shouldn't see." Clara laughed nervously, but Javier and I exchanged a look. Daniel wasn't the type to suggest something like this without a reason, and that night, for some reason, he seemed determined to go. "Are you serious?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. "Yeah," he replied, standing up from his chair. "Who's coming with me?" No one said anything at first. The idea of walking in the rain, in the middle of the night, to a cemetery wasn't exactly appealing. But Daniel insisted, and eventually Javier and I gave in. Clara flat out refused to join us, so she stayed at the apartment, promising to wait for us with a cup of hot chocolate. We left. The rain was so heavy we could barely see more than a few feet ahead. Daniel walked in front, flashlight in hand, while Javier and I followed, trying not to slip on the wet pavement. The cemetery wasn't far, but the walk felt endless. Every step we took seemed to pull us further away from reality, as if we were stepping into another world. When we arrived, the cemetery gate creaked as it opened. Daniel walked in without hesitation, but I paused for a moment at the entrance. The place was massive, with old headstones and angel statues that seemed to watch us from the shadows. Daniel's flashlight only illuminated small fragments of the path, leaving the rest in complete darkness. "What exactly are we looking for?" Javier asked, trying to sound calm, but his voice trembled slightly. "Something that shouldn't be here," Daniel replied without turning around. We walked among the graves, the sound of the rain mixing with the crunch of leaves under our feet. Suddenly, Daniel stopped. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, in the distance, I noticed a figure. It was tall, dressed in a black hood that covered its face. In its hand, it carried an old lantern, the kind that runs on oil, and the light it emitted was faint, as if it were about to go out. "Who is that?" I whispered, but Daniel didn't respond. He just stared at the figure, as if in a trance. The figure began to move toward us, slowly, almost gliding across the ground. Javier and I stepped back, but Daniel didn't move. He seemed hypnotized. "Daniel, let's go," I said, trying to grab his arm, but he shook me off. "Wait," he murmured. "I need to talk to him." "Talk to who?" "That guy isn't normal," I shouted, but Daniel was already walking toward the figure. Javier and I followed, even though every fiber of my being told me to run in the opposite direction. When Daniel reached the figure, it raised the lantern, illuminating its face. I couldn't see it clearly, but what I did see froze my blood. It wasn't a human face, or at least, not entirely. It was deformed, as if made of shadows and rotting flesh. Daniel began speaking to the figure in a language I didn't understand. It was a guttural whisper, as if the words were coming from a deep, dark place. Javier and I looked at each other, completely terrified. We didn't know what to do. Suddenly, the figure reached out a hand toward Daniel, and he took it. At that moment, the lantern went out, and everything was plunged into darkness. I shouted Daniel's name, but there was no response. I turned on my flashlight, but he was gone. The figure had disappeared too. "Daniel!" Javier yelled, running between the graves, but there was no trace of him. We searched for what felt like hours, but found nothing. Eventually, we had to return to the apartment, soaked and shaking. Clara was waiting for us, and when we told her what had happened, she refused to believe us. But the next day, when Daniel didn't show up, reality began to sink in. We reported his disappearance, but the police found nothing. There was no trace of him in the cemetery, no sign of the hooded figure. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. A week later, we got a call. It was from a funeral home. They had found Daniel's body in a viewing room, dressed in the same clothes he had been wearing that night. There was no explanation for how he had gotten there or what had caused his death. But the most terrifying part was what they found in his hand, a small old lantern, extinguished and covered in dirt. We never found out what happened that night in the cemetery. Javier and I stopped talking about it, but sometimes on rainy nights I dream about that figure and its lantern, and I wonder if maybe Daniel wasn't the only one who disappeared in that place.